Good morning to all. Wait a little bit as always for people to jump on here. While I'm waiting, I'll make a few announcements for anybody that's watching later. I made them during the church service too, but in case you didn't hear it there. First, schedule 6 p.m. Christmas Eve service. Let me know if you're coming, please. 10 a.m. Christmas Day service, communion service this week. If you're making videos of your kids for the Christmas Eve service children's video, please send that to me by Tuesday at the latest. I'd like to be able to have Wednesday to put that together. Oh, let's see, what else? As I mentioned, I received that call to Cheyenne, so I'd encourage you to keep that in your prayers and then give me any thoughts or comments that you might have with regard to that. I think that's all I've got in terms of announcements. We will continue to wait a little bit here. We're going to be jumping into Exodus. I figured why not keep going with the narrative here, right? The plan will not be to cover everything in Exodus, but to cover the narrative sections of Exodus, which is a good chunk of Exodus, right? But then you start to get into some of the minutia of the law, and we won't plan on going into that in any kind of detail. We might skim some of it to pull out a couple of salient points, but good morning to somebody who's on. We'll be doing Exodus chapters 1 and 2 today. You know, it's interesting the way that this book starts, and the things that we see in these first couple chapters, and the way that the rest of the Bible, well, particularly Hebrews 11, talks about these events. It shows us that even as believers, there can be a time to hide, a time to stand up, a time to kill, a time to run, even a time not to tell the truth. In these opening chapters, God's people will do all these things, and they'll do them all from faith. What does that mean for our lives? Is it an excuse to sin, or is it a reminder that we live as sinners in a sinful world, and that at the heart of our lives and our salvation is God's promise of a Savior who delivers you by faith, and that this promise then also brings us to follow him in holy lives? We'll wait here for a second, because now it says that there's nobody watching, so we might as well wait. It's always interesting balancing this, right? Because if you start doing the Bible study when there's nobody online, you're like, okay, well, there's nobody online. Well, that seems weird. It's like preaching when there's nobody in church. But then you realize that there's also going to be a video of it later, and the people are going to watch it later, and the people who watch it later are going to be like, come on, let's go here. Let's get this going. Anyway, verses 1 through 7 of Exodus, chapter 1. And actually, I'm really just going to read chapters of verses 6 and 7. The first 5 verses are just a list of the names of Jacob's sons who were down there in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. This is the setup for the book of Exodus, these 2 verses. The setup for the point of the book and for the crisis of the book, for the problem that they're going to run into. They have multiplied greatly, it says. We've skipped forward here. From Abraham, the Bible does this. It gives us, all kinds of details about people's lives for a while, and then boom, it'll skip a section. Because the important thing here is that like the next part of the fulfillment of God's promise is to turn this into a great nation, right? You got Isaac, and then you've got Jacob, and you've got Jacob's sons, and everything with that. And now the whole point of him bringing them down there to Egypt, and providing for them through Joseph, is to do that next thing, to make them a great nation. And we don't need to see the minutia of that. We get like something like 400 years of history here, like really briefly, right? They multiplied and grew greatly. They were fertile. He's nurturing them there. But now the next thing, this is a setup because this reminds us of the next thing that God's going to do. If he's made them into a great nation now, well, he's got to bring them to their land. They're in the wrong place. And it's also the setup for the problem, because this is going to be the crisis, that they've grown large and they're all throughout the land of Egypt, and there's this obvious distinction between them, and the Egyptians are going to be afraid of them. It's going to be the source of strife. It's going to be the reason that they become slaves. It's going to lead to this whole trouble. So that's the setup for the whole book, verses 8 through 14. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. A few things to note here. First, the Israelites hadn't done anything to make the Egyptians afraid of them. I mean, the only reason the Egyptians are afraid of the Israelites is because there's a lot of them. They're multiplying. They're being blessed. Notice how this continues this trend. God's blessing on his people causes this animosity from others. God's blessing of Jacob makes Laban jealous, even though Laban's benefiting from it too. The Egyptians have benefited greatly from God's blessing the Israelites among them. Like, for instance, by Joseph. Egypt, that thing that we mentioned the other week about this transfer of wealth, basically, that happened because of Joseph's plan, so that the Egyptian government grew very strong. This is undoubtedly part of what turns Egypt into such a great world power. Okay? They've benefited hugely from the Israelites, and yet now they're afraid of them, even though they've done nothing, which is, of course, really dumb. You have another option here, too. Besides, look, they're so mighty. Oh, no! What'll happen if some enemy attacks us and they join the enemy? Why would they do that? There's no reason at all that the Israelites would do that until now. If you treated them well, if you treated them like any of the rest of your citizens, if you were good to them, they wouldn't join your enemies. But now they would have reason to. I mean, that's not going to happen, but they certainly, you would think, would have reason to do so now. So his solution to this is slavery. He thinks that by enslaving them, he will make them weak. And there won't be as many of them, or that they'll be too poor, or too, heartbroken or something to do anything. And notice how highly analogous that is to some of what happened in America with the slave trade. Southern slave owners began to live in a great deal of fear of a slave uprising because, right? It's like it should be super obvious. If you treat people this way, they aren't going to like it. If you treat people well, you'll have a better relationship. They'll be your friend. They'll be loyal to you. Not if you do this. It's going to cause problems. And notice again that all of this comes from fear, right? This is a really good example. You look at the history of the world and every instance of racism that there's ever been, and this is obviously an instance of mass racism, right? Every single one of them, it's always fear that's behind it. Fear of somebody who's different. Fear that they're going to change how I live. Fear that I'm going to have to change for them. It's fear and selfishness and pride. It's just sin. That's where that kind of stuff comes from. And that's what's going on here with Pharaoh. All right, verses 15 to 22. And then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all the people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Okay, I mean, that's literally Hitler. You know, Hitler's the thing that everybody compares things to, and there's it's usually like a total overreaction. Okay, this is Hitler. I mean, Hitler, one of the things that he did with the concentration camps is, right, he's trying to do two things with the people that he's killing in those concentration camps. Two really wicked things. One, he's trying to get rid of Jewish people. That's the same thing here. The second thing that he's trying to do is get rid of, any sort of weakness. Anybody that had some kind of sickness. One of the things that he would do is, if you had a baby born with Down syndrome or something like that, he'd want him dead. Which, by the way, is which is extremely analogous to what people doing with abortion today. People who are proponents of abortion are gung-ho for oh yeah, you want to make sure that if you're pregnant, you can get a test to see if your baby has Down syndrome so that you can kill it. And they describe this as yeah, we're getting rid of Down syndrome. No, you're not. You're getting rid of people with Down syndrome. This isn't a treatment for a condition. It is the murder of people who have that condition. That'd be like saying, we found a cure for cancer. We'll kill everyone that has it. That's what that is, and that's insane, right? Now, back to Pharaoh. They tried to make the children of Israel weak, make them stop growing or whatever, through slavery. Didn't work. So his next plan is, infanticide, murder. And his first way of doing this is, he tells the midwives that they're supposed to kill the sons. And they don't do it. Because notice what it says, they fear God. That is so important here. It's remarkable. Think about how hard this would be. It's always difficult for humans, because of our fear of men, to obey God rather than men, because we're afraid of what they'll do to us. We're afraid of what men will do to us. We struggle to do that even in our culture, where there's not that much at stake, really, right? What happens if we don't do what, say that you have take something like peer pressure or whatever, or a fear of somebody thinking that you're awkward if you talk about Jesus, or if you tell somebody that you think that homosexuality is sinful, or whatever, some cultural issue of the day that's in contrast to Christian teaching, to the gospel. We can easily get silenced about things like that just because of fear of being disliked, right? These midwives had to have been in fear of their lives. But remember what Jesus said, do not fear him who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can kill both soul and body in hell. In another place, let him be your fear and let him be your dread. When we start with the fear of the Lord, right, what that means is, Solomon says fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, okay? And there's a lot that's in that phrase. It's this awe, there's this holy terror, but there's also just this extreme respect for who God is. It means knowing who our God is, knowing what he has done, and knowing what he can do, and knowing his law, and knowing everything about him that he teaches us. And when we know that, when we know that that's true, okay, we're in this awe of him. And we know that nothing compares to him. Imagine that you had two people telling you to do two different things, like in some movie, right? Say that you've got, this person over here who's threatening you. And he's maybe I don't know, say it's a movie with gangs, all right? You got this leader over here, he's got a gang of 20. And he's threatening you. Do this. And this guy over here, he's threatening you. No, you do this, but that guy's got a gang of 100. Well, which one are you going to listen to? Obviously the stronger one, right? Well, God's not a gang leader, but he's the strong one. There's no comparison between him and anyone else. So fear of the Lord begins with understanding who I am and who God is and being in awe of God for who he is. And this is what the fear of the Lord removes fear of anyone else. For two reasons. First, because nothing that anyone else can do to me is anything compared to what God can do to me, right? Right? God destroys both soul and body in hell. That's much worse than anything that man can do. Second, it destroys fear because the fear of the Lord, when it finds its proper place alongside faith, means that we have nothing to fear, right? We start there with God's law, this holy terror of the threats of the law, and realize that God is so much more fearful than anything else that if we fear him properly, we have nothing else to fear. And then in the gospel, that fear of God is taken away. Not the awe of God, but the fear of condemnation, because we're redeemed in Jesus Christ. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And so that means that we take all our fear, and instead of fearing any man, we fear only God. And then all that fear, that terror, is taken away, and that means the fear is gone. That's why John says perfect love casts out fear. There is no fear in love. Love comes from God, from his love for us. Casts out fear. So this is what the midwives have. They fear God. And so they, by faith, do what is obviously right and refuse to go along with that. And this is one of those things that I mentioned. In this section, we're going to see God's people doing all kinds of things. Okay? The midwives lie to Pharaoh. He asks, why aren't you killing these babies? Right? And they lie. That's what they do. They say, oh, it's just that we can't ever get there in time. Because these Hebrew women, they're so vigorous. They just give birth so quickly. They're just popping them out, right? It's ludicrous, right? It's not the reason. But they're serving God. What they do from faith. It says they fear God. It's an example of how we can easily fall into a trap of thinking that living the Christian life just means avoiding any sort of kind of little error, right? We think, oh, you shouldn't lie. Rahab did. The midwives did. And both of them are commended for it. Rahab's act is called an act of faith. She lied to those guards. Why did she do it? To protect life. Remember, too, that there isn't a commandment that says you shall not lie. There's a commandment that says you shall not bear false witness. And the emphasis of that commandment is on not just telling lies, right? But it's far wider than that. Because, for instance, one can tell the truth and horribly break that commandment. One can go and gossip about what somebody else has done. You can be telling the truth, but it's not really truth. It's not speaking the truth with love. Rahab, in what she's doing, she's not bearing false witness against her neighbor. She's protecting her neighbor's life. These midwives, they're doing the same thing. They fear God more than Pharaoh, and so it is better to obey God rather than men. So it's important for us to understand these commandments together and find the balance. That doesn't mean that one commandment is ever pitted against another. I don't want you to get that impression. But we want to think about these sorts of questions deeply in our daily lives. And the answer is not always some black and white, easy kind of legalistic thing. Okay? Being a person who tells the truth isn't necessarily, I'll give you another example. There are people out there who are who think that, it's all about speaking radical truths, right? And so they'll just say whatever is on their mind, no matter what. Like if their wife asks them if they look good in that dress, they'll just say, and they don't think so, they'll just say, no, you look terrible. That's not the same thing as speaking the truth in love. For lots of reasons. One, you don't always have to say what's on your mind. 2, what's on your mind isn't necessarily the truth. It can just be an opinion. It could also be wrong. And 3, the emphasis is on loving your neighbor. Using your words to care for and protect and love your neighbor. That's the point. We fail in that all the time, but the midwives not fail in that here. They're using their words to protect life. And in that sense, it's really the truth. Right? God's truth. God's faithfulness. The important thing, too, is that as sinners in a sinful world, everything that we do is tainted by sin. We have various motivations, right? In everything we do, it's never pure. And that's why faith is so important here. The midwives are going to be commended. Rahab's commended as doing what she does by faith because it's done by faith. And when we do something from faith, all the sin that's involved in everything we do is taken away, forgiven in Christ. And what's left is only faith. And so we're commended as if we did it perfectly, right? Going on here. One other thing here. Notice the ongoing theme here again as in Genesis. This continuing golden thread right alongside the promise of the Savior is that whatever these other people do to God's people, God blesses them. Whatever Pharaoh does, Pharaoh's like, we'll make them slaves, and that'll make them weak. Nope, makes them strong. Pharaoh's like, we'll kill their sons, and that'll make them weak. Nope, God blesses them. The midwives don't do it. God blesses the midwives. Pharaoh commands the people of Egypt to kill the Hebrew babies. Oh my goodness, think about what a terrible situation this puts the children of Israel in, yet they still grow strong. Think about the awful racism that must have raged throughout the land. People love to find a reason to hate on another group of people because for whatever twisted, sinful reason, it makes them feel better about themselves. And they love to have this sort of outlet for their cruelty. So, because people are cruel by nature. That's what the sinful nature is. So they must have been, so many people must have been delighting in this opportunity to kind of be the snitch, to find out if any of their Hebrew neighbors had a baby boy and to kill them. It's awful. But God continues to bless his people. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." This whole thing, again, is by faith. Hebrews comments on this. I'll move forward there to Hebrews 11 and read you what it has to say so far about the characters in this section. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. All right, we'll come back to the next verse here in a second, but notice the way this is worded. Certainly what Moses' parents did, and even Miriam, what they did was talk about an act of faith, right? Like to put a baby in a basket in a river? The Nile River? I mean, there's like hippos in there, which, by the way, are like super dangerous, and like crocodiles and stuff. And it's like a huge river. I mean, this is undoubtedly like in the reeds near the riverbank, kind of maybe a quieter section. But still, right? Talk about an act of faith. And just keeping the child, putting their lives in danger for this child that they know they could all be killed for keeping this child. And also, though, what I think is fascinating about the way that's worded in that section in Hebrews there is it says, by faith, Moses was hidden. Notice that while certainly it's also talking about the act that the parents did, it focuses on Moses. Moses as having faith as a baby. Moses is being hidden. Moses is being in a basket there in the water, being so helpless. That's faith. I mean, not just because he's helpless, but because he, even as a baby, has faith. And this is such a perfect image of faith. This is what God means when he says, this is what Jesus means when he talks about having faith like a little child. People sometimes, I think, get the idea that what he means is like, well, you have to be like credulous like a child. And that's not the focus. A child is helpless. A child can do nothing. They depend so much on their parents, on people around them, right? That's what Jesus is teaching us. Before God, we are helpless. We're children. We need him for everything. We are in such danger. We are surrounded by such trouble. We can't stand up against the devil or sin or death or any of it, right? We're like a baby in a basket in the Nile River, surrounded by dangers. And God is our salvation. We depend on him by faith, as Moses did. Look, also, I think it's pretty clear that Moses' family, this is like a plan they put together, right? This isn't just like, we'll put him in a basket and put it on the river, and then we'll just hope for the best. You know, maybe something good will happen, right? Maybe he'll get raised by crocodiles, right? Or whatever. Look, Miriam, they put him there, and then she waits nearby. It is not a coincidence that Pharaoh's daughter comes and bathes here. They know, right? I think clearly they know that this is the place that Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe, and so this is their plan. We'll put him there. She'll see the baby. She'll love the baby. It's a baby. Who doesn't love a baby? Like, if you put this baby in front of this, Pharaoh's daughter, she's not going to look at this beautiful baby and think, oh yeah, I want to crush his head. She's going to want to keep him. So she's going to see how helpless he is. When you see a baby that's so helpless, I mean, you can't help but love that child. So then Miriam's waiting nearby in order to come out and be like, oh, hey, I just happened to be here. You want me to go get you a midwife? Somebody to, not a midwife, sorry, a nurse? And then she goes and gets her mom. And I mean, look at the wonderful irony of the providence of this situation, that they end up being able to she ends up being able to raise her own son in her own home and get paid for doing it by Pharaoh's daughter. They're able to raise their son protected by Pharaoh. Think of how similar that is again to Joseph. Right, that Joseph ends up having this favor from Pharaoh, but they're being protected from here. They're being protected from Pharaoh's own edict by Pharaoh's daughter, and he's going to get the best sort of education. Also, think about how similar this is in terms of just think about like God's people in boats. That's what Moses is in here, a little tiny baby boat, like Noah. And even though Noah's boat was far bigger, he's still completely at the mercy of God, for God to make the waters recede, for God to keep him safe in the terrible storm and the raging of the waters. Like God's people, like Jonah in his boat, totally at God's mercy, thrown overboard. Like Jesus and his disciples in their boat on the Sea of Galilee. It's an image that keeps coming up. It's a perfect image for the church of God and for faith in God, to trust in him in those sorts of situations. Let's keep going here with verses 11 and following. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Let's go back to Hebrews 11 for a second for its commentary on this, okay? By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover. Okay, the reason why I read that far is because this demonstrates something. It tells you that when it says by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, that's talking about in a little bit when he's going to run away from Pharaoh. Which means that in the last section, what it's talking about when it says that by faith he chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, it's talking about what he does right here. This is the moment that's being highlighted. The moment when he sees God's people being mistreated, and he's this man of two worlds, right? He knows, he was raised with his family. They've taught him about the true God. He knows who he is. But he's also, after that, been raised in Pharaoh's household for like the next 30 years or whatever, and gotten this great education, and, right? He's this man of two worlds. And he's a man of two worlds that are opposed to each other, and he's got to pick. This is the situation that we all find ourselves in as disciples of Christ. We are in this world, but we are not of this world. You can't serve two masters. It's like standing with one foot in two different boats. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to push away from each other, and you're going to fall in the water. You got to get all the way in one, right? So it is with us in this world. You cannot be a disciple of Christ and love this world. Can't happen. Can't serve two masters, right? You got to jump in. And that's what Moses is doing. When he kills this Egyptian, the Bible calls that an act of faith. And I want to talk about that for a second. Two things. First, I think we tend to learn about this story as Moses having done something wrong. And the Bible doesn't say that. It calls it an act of faith, and it mentions that he's doing this to protect God's people. He's choosing God's people. That's the main focus here. That he is protecting life, and he is protecting God's people, and he's choosing to be with God's people. Now, that doesn't mean that everything about this was without sin. The Bible doesn't get into the details. We have this false tendency to try to go back and look at things that other people have done or that people did in the Bible and try to figure out, okay, was there any sin involved in this? Duh. They were sinners. We're sinners. Everything we do is tainted by sin, okay? The Bible is generally not so interested in that question. It's far more interested in faith. Did Moses go too far? Did he set out to, what was his intention? Was he trying to kill the man, or was he just trying to stop the man and he accidentally killed him? Did he get into a fight and he killed him? I don't know. Doesn't say. Was his motivation wrong? In part, undoubtedly, he's a sinner. But the main point is that in doing so, he is choosing the reproach of Christ, because he's going to bring upon himself the reproach of Pharaoh and others, right? Rather than the fleeting pleasures of sin. And when the writer of the Hebrews says this, it's got immediate application to his hearers. You know, for instance, one of the things that the writer of the Hebrews is talking about when he does this is he's writing this to Jewish believers who are this is at least part of his audience, who are being tempted to turn back to Judaism because of the hatred of Jews who have rejected Jesus. Think about how ironic that is, right? Because now what he's saying to them is that those Jews who have rejected Jesus and who are hating them and persecuting them because they've believed in Christ, they are like Pharaoh and the Egyptians who enslaved God's people. They like Pharaoh, who's now angry at Moses because Moses has done this. Now think too who this Pharaoh is. I don't really know whether it's, how old the guy is or anything, right? But remember that Moses has grown up in Pharaoh's household for 30 years. He's had the best education. If this Pharaoh is the father of the princess who raised Moses still, he's pretty old now, Moses would know him well. If it's that guy's son, Moses probably grew up with the guy, right? So Moses knows him, and Moses has got all the best of Egypt, and he chooses God's people and chooses the reproach. He chooses the cross instead. Why? Because he considered the reward far greater. And that's what the writer of the Hebrews is talking about. That's it for us as well. Before us lies God's promise. Moses is looking towards the promise that God had made his people of the promised land and of the Christ. We're looking forward to that promise of eternal life. That trumps everything. Just like the fear of God trumps everything that man could do to us, so the promise and the hope that God gives us trumps everything in this world. It can make every burden light by comparison. Going on here. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, Why do you strike your companion? He answered, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, Surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill himself. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a wall. Oh, sorry, I just said he sought to kill himself. That's not what it says. He sought to kill Moses. Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because it says that he flees, he's afraid. And then in Hebrews it says that he left Egypt not being afraid. It shows you something. Again, we're sinners and we're saints. He's afraid. He's also not afraid. He's afraid because of what Pharaoh can do to him, but at the same time, he's not afraid because he trusts in God. Also, think about this reaction that these people have to Moses. How human. He says, "Why are you striking your companion?" Right? The other day he had seen the Egyptian doing it to them. He's like, "Oh, the Egyptians are doing this to us. Why are you doing it to each other?" And it's such a silly human thing that they say. "Well, who made you a judge or a prince over us? Did he claim to be a judge or a prince?" He asked them a question, a common human question. Why do that to each other? Oh, how don't we do this? Whenever anyone suggests that what we're doing maybe isn't the best way to do something, we just don't be, you're just judging me, right? We got to stop this. It's so important for us to learn how to take advice. So important for us to learn how to take correction from other people and not to just bristle at it and not to get just offended by it and to lash out and as they do here. "Are you going to kill one of us?" they say. Well, that's what spooks Moses and eventually has him running away. So he goes and sits down by a well. 16 to 22. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with that man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." It's interesting in a couple of ways, isn't it? Notice how closely related this is to, when Eliezer finds Rebekah for Isaac, and then when Jacob meets Rachel at this well. Apparently, this is the place to go if you are unlucky in love and you want to find somebody, right? You go to the well. It's like online dating thousands of years ago. Go to the well and see who shows up. Second, notice how he speaks about being a sojourner. He names his son Gershom, meaning sojourner, because he's away from the land where he grew up. But God's people in that land are sojourners too. That's not their home. And that brings us to the last 2 verses, or last 3 verses. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Track the words here of these verbs of God. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. The drama is thick, and what it's setting up is clear. God is going to act. This is going to be the next big thing that he's going to do in fulfilling his promise. Whenever we get that phrase, he remembered his covenant, doesn't mean that he had forgotten. It means he's about to act. By a child saved from Pharaoh, by Pharaoh, who now runs from Pharaoh, God will deliver his people from Pharaoh. By faith, that's what this really being emphasized. By faith, they had the child. By faith, Moses sits there in the basket waiting on God to deliver him. By faith, he strikes down that Egyptian and is counted as one of the people of God. Chooses this outcast life with God's people for the reward of God's promises rather than the fleeting pleasures of sin. And think about what a close call is involved in all of this. So many points in the history of God's people, there's these close calls. How easily Moses could have died and never been there for God to use him to save his people. And think about how this gives him the chance to grow and learn about his people and about his God, and how this will later give him the faith and the courage to stand up and identify with God's people, and how God is using all of these things in Moses' life to shape him, to bring him back to that faith again and again, that faith that he had as a child in a basket, and again and again to show him that he must rely on God, so that eventually, as we'll see next time, he'll be ready for God to use him. That's as far as we'll go today. As always, pop any questions in the comments. I can always go and look later and write an answer to them or bring it up next week. And Lord be with you.